The FBI doesn't haul ground-penetrating radar onto a property unless they already have a sure thing. They don't show up with cadaver dogs, digging tools, and evidence markers on a hunch. They show up because the data commanded it. And when federal forensic teams descended on the property tied to Annie Guthrie, the data had already been screaming at them. This was the exact moment Nancy Guthrie's case stopped being a simple missing persons investigation. Let's be clear about what a backyard search at this level actually means in a federal investigation. This isn't local police scanning the perimeter with handheld flashlights. Ground-penetrating radar is expensive, highly specialized, and requires trained operators. Human remains, detection dogs only come in when biological material is suspected underground. Forensic photographers and evidence markers don't tag along with digging crews unless commanders are already certain there's something hidden down there. Authorizing a search of this massive scale is never decided overnight. It happens after weeks, sometimes months, of forensic leads converging toward a point of no return. A judge signs the warrant, the team mobilizes, and then they move in. So the first question isn't what they found. The real question is what led them to that specific spot in the first place. Because a backyard doesn't become the epicenter of a federal investigation by accident. Reports indicate investigators focused on several physical anomalies on the property and patterns of disturbed soil, recent changes in the landscaping, hidden burn areas, and underground disruptions picked up below the surface by radar. Each of these 4 signs could have an innocent explanation. A backyard renovation, a bonfire, natural soil settling. But all 4 together, on a property linked to a key figure in a federal missing persons case, after months of fieldwork, create a chilling convergence. That is what transforms a theoretical suspicion into an active, high-stakes operation. Patterns of disturbed soil are particularly telling in this investigation. Forensic soil analysis determines whether dirt was moved recently or years ago. The composition shifts, and natural layers are disrupted. Expert investigators and forensic geologists can analyze a single clump of earth and prove with high certainty if it was recently dug up, or if something was buried there. The presence of burn pits adds another deeply alarming layer of suspicion. A controlled burn close to a building, far from any normal fire pit, is a major behavioral red flag. It suggests an intent to destroy evidence, organic remains, or both. In missing persons cases that shift to homicide investigations, any burn sites found close to a home are immediately treated as top priority forensic zones. And those anomalies detected deep underground by the radar are what turns circumstantial clues into an absolute, urgent investigative priority. This is what the public never saw coming. While the public focused on the broader story of Nancy's disappearance, the theories, the timelines, and the family dynamics, federal investigators were quietly pursuing a parallel track of forensic inquiry, a digital reconstruction and physical evidence trail that had been pointing to this property much longer than anyone realized. The backyard search did not happen out of the blue. It was the direct result of crucial witness statements, forensic contradictions that had been piling up in the case file, specific digital reconstructions, and most importantly, anonymous tips that guided investigators straight to that patch of land. Anonymous tips in federal investigations are not handled the way they are in the movies. They aren't acted on immediately. They are logged, cross-referenced with existing proof, and vetted for consistency. A tip that independently corroborates the forensic record gains top priority. Any lead that contradicts known evidence is instantly discarded. The fact that law enforcement searched this property suggests those tips did not contradict the forensic file. Instead, they confirmed it. And that raises an uncomfortable question about what the forensic trail had already been quietly building. Let's talk about Tommaso Cioni, because it's impossible to grasp this investigation's direction without understanding how critical his timeline has become. Reports indicate that investigators heavily stepped up surveillance on several key areas. His movements, his communication patterns, his digital activity, and what investigators called intentional silences, not silences of absence. There is a difference. Absence means the data never existed. Silence means the information is there, but was deliberately deleted, wiped, or completely hidden away. Digital forensics in this case focused heavily on deleted messages and GPS location reconstruction, late-night phone activity, metadata analysis, and synced device logs, a damning forensic package. This isn't some basic scan. It is a full digital autopsy of a person's entire communication history. And that midnight log is where things get dark. Today, mobile and GPS tracking data reveal far more than just location. They show exactly where they were, when, for how long, and whether the device was stationary or moving. It tracks the direction of travel and, critically, when the phone went dead. A device going silent is never a neutral event. When a phone suddenly shuts down right after active communication, the forensic significance is impossible to ignore. Detectives call these windows digital gaps that, when paired with physical evidence and witness testimony, begin to tell a story. Tommaso's timeline was full of these windows, silent gaps and mysterious, unexplained bursts of movement. These are moments where the digital trail, usually constant and trackable, just stops. The criminal implication is clear. Those dark gaps are the exact windows when police suspect the crime took place. The missing data in those windows isn't an alibi. It is the target. Overlaying these travel windows with the timeline of Nancy's disappearance and matching them with physical anomalies on the property, you start to see why federal agents were out in that backyard with digging equipment. The breakthrough came when forensic anthropologists unearthed human remains in an area linked to Annie Guthrie's backyard. The investigation had just crossed a point of no return. In missing persons cases, uncertainty is the norm. The victim is just gone. Clues scatter in all directions and theories multiply, but the central mystery of what happened remains unsolved. But when remains are found on land directly tied to key suspects, the case completely shifts. It is no longer a search to find where someone went. Now the question is who did it, how, and how they hid it. The massive forensic response proved the severity. Officers widened the crime scene perimeter and began taking highly detailed forensic photographs to document everything. They also gathered DNA samples to match against Nancy's known genetic profile. The rigorous process of preserving evidence was designed to lock down the chain of custody for trial. That detail is everything. Securing evidence for trial is very different from just collecting clues for a lead. When crime scene techs shift to trial-level collection, it shows investigators believe this case is headed to court. This is a massive turning point. It means the investigation is no longer just looking for answers. Let's pause right here, because this is where the story becomes incredibly complex from a psychological standpoint. The theory of hiding a body close to home has gained major traction, and this backyard discovery is damning proof. There is deep psychological research behind this specific behavioral pattern. When a victim is hidden near a suspect's own property, detectives look for two psychological factors: confidence and control. Confidence that the property will never be searched by police, and control over the environment. The ability to watch the site, maintain it, and change it if needed. The property linked to Annie Guthrie showed signs of recent landscaping. That right there is the control factor. If you buried something and see the police closing in, you have both the motive and the access. It lets you modify the surface, making freshly dug soil look undisturbed to erase any visual traces of a grave. But those cover-ups cannot fool ground-penetrating radar or advanced forensic soil analysis. You cannot change what lies beneath. And investigators, as it turns out, were already looking under the surface. You cannot hide what that backyard holds. And police, by all accounts, had already started digging. Now, this is what makes the case so chilling: the digital forensics and the physical evidence, developed side by side. And it seems every piece of evidence guided detectives directly to the next. Cyber analysis, deleted text messages, and GPS data provided critical leads for the team. Crucial metadata analysis helped police map out Tommaso's movements during highly specific windows of time. His movements overlapped with the property, and that critical match pointed forensic investigators straight to the site. The disturbed ground instantly validated, in hindsight, the extreme importance of those digital tracking patterns. This is what experts call convergence, when two entirely separate forensic paths lead to the exact same spot. That is the exact evidentiary standard federal prosecutors demand before acting, since it is incredibly tough to justify. You can argue the digital evidence was misinterpreted, or claim that the physical evidence was contaminated, but proving both happened at once to yield the exact same result is a much harder story to sell. When a digital footprint leads to a property, and physical evidence confirms something is buried right there, alternative explanations quickly start to fall apart. And there is another quiet detail almost nobody is discussing. It is about rebuilding the timeline. Federal investigators spent days piecing together what they call a hidden chronology. Entire blocks of time and actions deliberately erased, things investigators were never supposed to find. Gaps in surveillance footage and deleted metadata pulled back from automatic cloud backups, and fully synced communication logs that, once pieced together, told a completely different story than the official narrative. Modern digital forensics operates on a simple truth that most people do not fully grasp. Deleting is rarely final. Erased files on a phone or computer do not just vanish. They are simply marked as free space to be overwritten. Until then, that data is still recoverable. Cloud syncing complicates this, because your devices backup data before you can even delete them locally. That backup sits on remote servers completely outside your control, ready for police once they get a warrant. Tommaso's allegedly deleted texts never vanished. They were always there, and their alleged contents were alarming enough to completely redirect the physical search. Once mapped out, this hidden timeline apparently exposed movement routes and calls police were never meant to see. The digital mask carefully built to hide those critical hours collapsed under expert forensic analysis. And right in the middle of that digital collapse, GPS coordinates popped up pointing straight to the backyard. Now we have to talk about Annie Guthrie, because her role in this case is absolutely critical. The property is tied directly to her. The search took place on, or very close to her land. Reports show investigators have kept her under tight, round-the-clock surveillance this entire time. Hiding something so close to home implicates more than just the culprit. It points to the environment that allowed it. There are two paths to a cover-up. Active involvement means you knew, helped, or made it happen. Then there is passive involvement, knowing nothing but providing the perfect space for it to happen. Prosecutors have not yet publicly clarified which category Annie Guthrie falls into, but the forensic sweep of her land suggests police think she is key to answering that question. Whether they see her as a suspect, a vital witness, or a victim whose land was used without permission, these are massive legal distinctions that will ultimately shape the course of any criminal trial. The only clear thing is that her backyard has become, according to the authorities, one of the most critical forensic hotspots of the entire case. And that label is not based on mere suspicion, but on what investigators allegedly discovered there. There is another deeply unsettling detail worth looking at. Investigators noted the property had distinct surveillance blind spots, areas out of camera range and hidden from neighbors. This sparked the theory that whoever did this knew the land intimately and knew exactly where those blind spots were. They knew how to slip in without tripping alarms, and the exact window of time to move unseen. That level of familiarity with the security layout points directly to someone who had regular access. Not a stranger, and not a one-time visitor, but someone capable of mapping out every single one of its weak points. In missing persons cases that shift to homicide investigations, this level of insider knowledge immediately shrinks the suspect pool to those closest to the victim or owner. It is a clear behavioral pattern that became one of the strongest investigative leads for the police. The inside accomplice theory, suggesting the killer knew the family routine and home layout inside out, gained massive weight as forensic evidence piled up. This is the most chilling part of the case, because it means the threat never came from the outside. They were already inside. Let's step back and look at the bigger picture of what has reportedly unfolded in this investigation. Because when you lay out the facts chronologically, the truth becomes undeniable. Nancy Guthrie vanishes. That is how a missing person investigation begins. At first, detectives focus on rebuilding the timeline, tracking movements, checking communications, and identifying key suspects. Routine procedure. But at some point, even if public timelines do not show the exact moment, detectives launched a parallel forensic track on Tommaso Cioni. His digital footprint was seized and meticulously analyzed. They mapped his movement patterns and uncovered communication gaps, just waiting to be restored. That hidden timeline started taking shape from deleted and recovered data. Simultaneously, witness tips and anonymous leads began pointing to Annie Guthrie's property. Those leads, cross-referenced with forensic analysis, met the strict evidentiary threshold for a search warrant. Federal agents swarmed the property armed with ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, heavy excavation gear, and forensic experts. They documented physical anomalies in the soil, freshly turned earth, burn spots, and underground disturbances. As digging progressed, they recovered what appeared to be human remains. DNA collection started immediately. Securing evidence for a future trial began. The case officially shifted from a missing persons search to a recovery operation. The shape of this narrative arc is unmistakable, leading us inevitably toward a very specific spot, a Tucson backyard that should have been the last place anyone would look. Where does this case go from here? Forensic DNA analysis is the next critical step. If DNA confirms the remains belong to Nancy Guthrie, the case instantly becomes a homicide investigation with a verified crime scene. That completely alters the legal exposure for everyone tied to the property and the digital paper trail. Federal genetic testing usually takes weeks, especially if the condition of the remains demands highly specialized lab work. But once those results land, they will either confirm the worst fears or completely redirect the search to identify the body, sparking an entirely new set of chilling questions. The mountain of digital evidence built against Tommaso will also be re-examined right then. Movement patterns that once suggested hiding a missing person would now align perfectly with disposing of a body. Those communication gaps that hinted at deliberate radio silence at critical moments turn into highly suspicious silences during the exact window of a potential murder. The evidentiary weight of the digital record does not just hold, it multiplies. There is another dimension showing just how long this investigation was quietly progressing beneath the surface. To the public, the case seemed to stall on several occasions. The initial frenzy after Nancy disappeared faded into complete silence. Updates from investigators were virtually non-existent. From the outside, progress looked slow or entirely halted. But federal investigators often create this illusion on purpose. While law enforcement runs digital forensics, conducts surveillance, and flips informants, and drafts search warrants, they never tip their hand. They keep quiet. And that heavy silence defining the middle of the case certainly did not mean inactivity. It was the strategic quiet of an investigation building toward a critical breakthrough. That breakthrough was the backyard search. Those months of apparent standstill were filled with grueling forensic work, metadata reconstruction, and GPS analysis. They were securing warrants and watching the property, setting the stage for the day the feds arrived in force. The case never stopped. It went underground, figuratively at first, and ultimately, in a literal sense. Brian Entin, who has been covering this story, was one of the very few journalists to keep the public's eyes on the investigation during those periods of total radio silence. His reporting closely followed every single development as they slowly came to light. His media presence shows this case is drawing serious investigative reporters, not just true crime enthusiasts. That distinction is crucial. When highly credible reporters dog a case for this long, it usually means they have inside sources feeding them developments long before official press releases. Entin's persistence through the quiet times proves the case was never as dead as it seemed. The psychological depth of this case demands our attention, as it is exactly what has captivated the public for so long. Nancy Guthrie did not vanish in some parking lot or while traveling alone through an unfamiliar city. She vanished right from her own social circle, surrounded by family and people who supposedly knew her best. The terror in this scenario does not stem from strangers or random acts of violence. It is the specific horror of being harmed by someone close to you, someone trusted, someone with access, whose very presence would never raise any red flags. Now, investigators are swarming a backyard tied to that inner circle, where human remains have reportedly been uncovered. The emotional weight of shifting from a missing person search to a forensic discovery on family property is absolutely staggering, not just for the active investigation, but for everyone who knew Nancy and for her entire community. For anyone who followed this case, desperately holding on to hope for a very different ending, the case forces us to confront a dark possibility that the most dangerous place for Nancy was right beside the people she trusted. This is what the mountain of evidence suggests about the final picture investigators are currently piecing together. There is a digital forensic trail revealing deliberate concealment and wiped communications, manufactured gaps in movement, and digital silence during specific windows of time. Physical evidence on the linked property shows disturbed soil, burn marks, and underground anomalies consistent with a burial. Federal investigators made the call to dig, and they have reportedly recovered human remains. DNA collection and the preservation of trial-ready evidence are currently underway. Every single detail matters. Together, they paint a picture of an investigation crossing the threshold from uncertainty to forensic certainty. Not the legal certainty a jury demands, but investigative certainty, the kind that mobilizes federal resources, search warrants, and recovery teams. Investigators are no longer asking what happened to Nancy Guthrie. They are building the case to prove it. And this is where the Tommaso aspect holds such forensic weight. If digital evidence shows intentional deletion, manufactured gaps, and active concealment during specific movement windows, and if those timelines align with the property where remains were found, the chain of evidence becomes nearly unbreakable. Defense attorneys facing such an overwhelming convergence of evidence confront a major structural problem. They cannot simply claim one piece of evidence is unreliable, because multiple independent threads all point to the same conclusion. They must challenge the entire forensic architecture all at once. That means tearing down the digital reconstruction, the GPS data, the physical clues, the soil analysis, the cadaver dog alerts, the excavation itself, and the DNA. Dismantling all of that simultaneously is not impossible, but it requires every single rebuttal to succeed individually. And the likelihood of pulling that off shrinks exponentially with every new piece of forensic proof added to the file. Federal prosecutors are not just pulling on a single thread. They are weaving an entire net. And the discovery in that backyard is where it becomes absolutely undeniable. What remains unclear publicly, and what investigators are trying to solve behind closed doors, is who knew what. Annie Guthrie's position in this story remains highly complex. Since her property is the recovery site, reports suggest investigators have heavily intensified the pressure on her recently. But pressure does not equal guilt. Land can easily be used without the owner's consent or knowledge. It is entirely possible to hide something on the property of people who had nothing to do with the crime. Nailing down exactly what Annie knew, when she knew it, and what she chose to do with that information is a top priority today. If she knew what was happening on her land and covered it up, her legal situation is incredibly grave. But if they used her land behind her back, she becomes a witness, and potentially a key one. Her ultimate fate in this investigation will clear up once the forensic results come in. DNA confirmation would speed up the legal timeline considerably. Let's look closer at the importance of cadaver dogs, a detail that is far too easy to overlook. Handlers do not bring these dogs to a site simply because they suspect something might be buried there. They deploy them because existing evidence already points to a very high probability of finding human remains. And these dogs do more than confirm suspicions, they narrow the search grid. They easily tell a surface scent from something buried deep underground. They guide excavation crews to precise spots within the area, with an accuracy that radar simply cannot match. Bringing cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar onto the property makes it clear that investigators were not just stumbling around in the dark. They were hunting for specific targets. The radar had already flagged anomalies. Now, the dogs had to confirm the biological source and pinpoint the exact dig site. This is not the protocol for a speculative search. We are talking about a recovery operation. And the difference is massive. A speculative search is purely exploratory. Out there, you have no idea what you will find. Recovery is targeted. You have solid evidence to believe you know what is waiting. So you bring in specialized resources to recover it. The federal team arriving at Annie Guthrie's property was reportedly conducting a full forensic recovery operation. There comes a point in every criminal investigation where the public narrative and the cold, hard facts finally align. Cold cases take a turn. Abstract suspicions suddenly gain real names, detailed timelines, and rigorous forensic precision. The Nancy Guthrie case has just reached that critical point. People believed it was just a missing persons case with loose ends and conflicting theories. But the truth, as it turned out, was a federal forensic operation with physical and digital evidence pointing to key suspects in a very specific location. The massive gap between those two versions finally closed in a quiet backyard in Tucson. Here is where things stand. According to recent reports, human remains have been recovered at a site linked to Annie Guthrie's property. DNA testing is already underway. The forensic team who did the digging secured all recovered material under strict legal protocols for a future trial, which proves that prosecutors view this as highly decisive evidence. Tommaso Cioni's digital footprint has been reconstructed, recovering deleted messages and GPS coordinates, focusing on his mysterious moments of digital silence. That data matches up perfectly with the property and the day Nancy vanished. Annie Guthrie's actual role in this case, whether as a suspect, witness, or both, remains unclear to the public. But the thorough search of her property elevates her significance in the coming legal proceedings. This case is no longer an unsolved mystery. It is a truth being rebuilt brick by brick. One final detail: the hardest part of following an investigation like this is not the forensic complexity or piecing together the timeline, nor is it the emotional weight of physical evidence. The truly painful part is holding two conflicting realities in your mind at the same time. The first is that federal agents finally found exactly what they were looking for. That after months of digital tracking, forensic analysis, and physical excavation, the trail of evidence led to a real, specific, and permanent place. That there is now an active body recovery operation where there was once only a missing person. The second is what this discovery represents. Not just legally, but for Nancy Guthrie and everyone who loved her. Those who spent months of agonizing silence, hoping this story would end differently. It did not. Now, the only task left is making sure Nancy Guthrie's fate is proven forensically, definitively, and in a court of law for every single person responsible. The FBI brought ground radar, search dogs, and heavy excavation machinery to that backyard because the clues led them there. And those clues did not lie.